All right, guys, so today we're going to do 3 mini lessons. We're going to talk about 3 different topics, and then tomorrow's assignment, you're going to choose one of 3 activities to complete. So on Google Classroom, it's going to have 3 options, and you only choose one assignment to complete tomorrow, okay? So our first topic is architecture and art in the Middle Ages. Before the Middle Ages, we had what was called Romanesque churches, okay? And so these churches were designed very differently. They had flat roofs, they were very, very dark, and they had tiny, tiny slated windows. So there was no light whatsoever coming in. And they were a Romanesque style, which means if you think about Roman buildings, lots of columns. So these churches were filled with columns, which meant there wasn't a lot of space for people to kind of move around. So you can see in this Romanesque church, one, they give it a design that symbolizes a cross. So it goes up and down and then back and forth at the top. And you see inside here all the columns, okay? They're everywhere. And the reason for that was because the roof was so heavy, made of stone, that they needed a lot of support in the walls in order to hold up that roof. And these tiny little windows here that were located on these churches gave very little light into these buildings. So they had these thick walls, they had round arches, very sturdy piers, and they had small windows to keep the strength of the walls really strong, okay? And it really didn't give you a sense of faith or spirituality when you walked in because it was so dark and so kind of closed off. So with the Middle Ages, we come up with this new design called Gothic. And I know the first thing that jumps in your head when you think Gothic is kind of dark or dreary. In actuality, Gothic is all about light and openness. And so they utilized 2 different things. They arched the ceilings really high up in the air, and they did that using these ribbed vaults right here with pointed arches so that you could have a much higher ceiling. And the idea being they would paint through these areas here. When you walked into the church, you looked up. Just like you were looking up to God, you were looking up at all the kind of the artwork and things on the ceiling. The second thing they put in was this piece outside the building, and this is called the flying buttress, and this supports the walls on the outside so that you can have more room on the inside, and that also gives us the ability to have a ton of windows, and this is where we developed stained glass windows. So they put these beautiful windows that reflected light and color into the church to brighten up the church. So this would be what a typical wall would look like for a Gothic style. You can see all the windows that are located in here that all would have been stained glass. Here's the flying buttress that allows you to have support on the outside. And then the vaulted ceilings are much higher than the original churches. So you can kind of see the difference. Before the Middle Ages, we have a Romanesque style over here, really tiny windows, the low heavy roof. Now we have this Gothic style that has big windows with lots of color and light. We have the flying buttress on the outside that gives it support, and the much higher ceiling or arches. Okay, so that's mini lesson number 1. Mini lesson number 2. Pull that down. There we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about literature. When everybody was writing books during this time, they were writing them in Latin, and the only people that could read Latin were scholars and priests. So some of the authors decided they were going to start to use what we call vernacular. And all that means is they're using everyday speech or slang to write the books so that common people want to read them because they'll understand them. So instead of me writing some very, very advanced paper with scientific terms that you guys don't understand, if I broke it down and just used words that teenagers understand, they'd be more likely to read it and understand it. And that's what they did during this time period. There were 2 types of literature. The first was the troubadour poem, and the second was the heroic epic. The troubadour poem was a product of the knights. It was a poem about how much they loved a woman who inspired them to become braver or better, and troubadour poetry was very popular. The second was the heroic epic, where you would write about a particular event, like maybe a battle that took place. And they would exaggerate the details of the battle to make it so interesting that more people would want to read it. So if I were to say to you, oh, I went and caught a fish and it was 25 feet long, that's a much better story than me saying, well, I caught a fish and it was 1 foot long. So the idea with the heroic epic is to exaggerate it to the point where people want to read it. And the most famous of that one was the Song of Roland, which became really popular in France. But more interesting about the literature, in my opinion, is the fact that when they wrote these books, and you can see this is a page from a book, the pages were actually considered works of art because there's no printing press or copy machine to make dozens of copies of a book. So when you want to write a book and illustrate something like you see the illustration here, you had to hand paint it every single time you made a different version of your book for someone. So it was an artistic expression. You see how beautiful the writing is, the details in the flowers and the horse and the grass. So they really made their books into pieces of art. That's the end of our second mini lesson, and our last one is about universities or education during that time. So we see our first universities that are established. The first one established in 1088 was in Bologna, Italy. Not far after that was the Sorbonne, which is in Paris, and then Oxford, which is in England. So we see three major universities that are there. There were only three things you could study at that time. You could either earn a doctorate in law, in medicine, or theology. And theology was the most highly regarded because it was so difficult. Because in theology, they had to learn how to take science and faith and bring the two together. Now, we have St. Thomas Aquinas, who's kind of an expert on this idea of bringing science and faith together. And he wrote this idea that concluded that your science cannot conflict with your faiths because they go hand in hand. He is a patron saint of the Catholics for the students in universities. He was born today. Today is his birthday, born in 1226. And he's regarded as one of the most famous thinkers of all time. And so he has a lot of really famous quotes. The first one is, "Beware of the person of one book," meaning don't try to talk to people who are only open to one idea, because it's dangerous to only be open to one idea. So he has a lot of really great quotes that we'll look at a little bit more in one of the activities tomorrow. So tomorrow on Google Classroom, there's going to be 3 choices of assignments for you to do. You only have to choose one. So please choose the one that interests you the most so that you get a good grade on it. And if you have questions, just send them to me by email.